I went to my granddaughter's wedding at the Four Seasons Hotel Philadelphia in Philadelphia, carrying a vintage pearl necklace that belonged to my late wife. But at the grand ballroom doors, my own son blocked my path. He looked me dead in the eye and whispered, "Dad, you are not on the list. There was a mistake. Go home." 200 of Philadelphia's most prominent guests had their eyes fixed on me. I neither raised my voice nor lowered myself to pleading. I simply replied, "It is fine, son." Then I turned, stepped out into that bitter cold night, settled into my car, and dialed my attorney. Welcome to Dadrevenge, a place where real stories of betrayal, loyalty, and hard-won justice find their voice. If stories like this one speak to you, stay close and follow along. There is always another one worth hearing. I'd love to know, is this your first time here, or have you been riding along with me for a while? Drop a word in the comments. It genuinely means something to me to know who's listening. A quick note before we go further: some elements of this story have been shaped for the telling, and any resemblance to specific real people or events is purely coincidental. What matters is the truth inside the story, and that part is very real. Let me walk you through exactly what unfolded. The winter wind tearing across Fairmount Park was savage that evening, yet I barely registered the cold. 70 years old, dressed in a custom Brioni tuxedo my late wife Diane had always adored. I carried in my right pocket a worn velvet box pressed close against my chest. Nestled inside was Diane's vintage pearl necklace, the very one she wore on our wedding day 45 years ago. I had been holding it for this precise moment, planning to clasp it around my granddaughter Piper's neck before she walked down the aisle. I stepped out of my Mercedes S-Class sedan and surrendered the keys to the valet, drawing a slow breath of the crisp December air. The Four Seasons Hotel Philadelphia lobby greeted me with warmth and splendor. Soft string quartet music drifted through the air, weaving through the murmur of moneyed conversation and the delicate chime of crystal. I moved toward the grand ballroom with a deep, quiet pride rising in my chest. 40 years I had spent turning Caldwell Global Supply from a single rusted delivery truck into a global logistics empire. My youth, my sleep, countless weekends all surrendered, so my family would never taste poverty. Tonight was meant to be the reward for every one of those sacrifices. I was going to watch my granddaughter marry the man she loved at a celebration I had personally bankrolled in full. As I neared the carved mahogany doors of the ballroom, the heavy fragrance of imported white orchids saturated the corridor. I smiled, recognizing the flowers. Then I saw him. My son Derek stood squarely at the entrance, sharp in a tailored tailcoat. For one brief instant, my heart lifted. I assumed he was there to receive me, to usher me inside, and walk me to the family table. I raised my hand, but as the distance closed, the smile drained from my face. Derek's posture was a wall. His jaw was locked, his eyes darting toward the crowd behind him, hollow of any warmth. He moved directly into my path, planting his broad shoulders across the double doors. "Dad," he breathed, his voice pulled tight and low. "What are you doing here?" The question knocked me sideways. "What do you mean?" "What am I doing?" "Derek, I am here for Piper's wedding." I pressed my hand to my pocket. "I brought your mother's pearls for her." Derek swallowed, stealing a glance over his shoulder before his face reset into a mask of cold indifference. "Dad, you are not on the list." I held his gaze, turning the words over in my mind. I was certain it was some clumsy attempt at wedding day humor. "Not on the list." "Derek, I am the grandfather of the bride." "There was a mistake with the seating chart," he said, never blinking. "The venue is at strict capacity. The fire marshal is very particular about these things. There is literally no chair for you in there. Go home, Dad. Go home before you cause a scene and ruin Piper's night." My blood went cold. The audacity of those words hung in the air like a physical blow. A mistake. Strict capacity. 6 months ago, Derek had appeared at my door with his hand out. He told me Piper needed capital for her new startup and a budget for the wedding. Without a moment's hesitation, I had my bank wire $1.2 million directly into his personal account. I financed every inch of this lavish affair. The champagne flowing inside the imported orchids lining the halls, the string orchestra playing in the background, I paid for every last bit of it. And now the man who took my money was planted in that doorway, telling me there was no seat for me. Before I could form a single word in response, a figure emerged from the shadows of the ballroom entrance. My daughter-in-law, Renata. She floated out in a designer silk gown, champagne flute in hand, and slipped her arm through Derek's before fixing me with an expression of pure, unmasked contempt. It was the look you reserve for a vagrant who has wandered too close to your table at a fine restaurant. "Gerald, what part of go home do you not understand?" She sneered, her voice soaked in venom. "This is an exclusive event. We cannot have you wandering around confusing the guests. We have important people here tonight." I looked past her into the blazing light of the ballroom. The doors stood open wide enough to reveal the crowd. These were not merely the bride and groom's social circle. I knew these faces. Venture capitalists I had once sat across negotiating tables from. Shipping magnates. Former partners out of Caldwell Global Supply. These were my peers, my colleagues, the inner ring of the Philadelphia business world, and every one of them was watching me. I could see them murmuring to one another, covering their mouths with their hands, pointing subtly at the 70-year-old founder of the company being turned away at the door like a common wedding crasher. The humiliation scorched my face, but it was instantly consumed by a glacial clarity. Renata leaned in close, her heavy perfume turning my stomach. "Security is standing right over there. Gerald, if you do not turn around and walk out those doors right now, I will have them remove you from the premises. Do not test me." Any other father might have erupted. Any other man might have demanded to see his granddaughter or ignited a scene to expose them before those 200 guests. But I did not survive 40 years in the corporate Shark Tank by throwing tantrums. I understood that losing my composure would only lend credibility to whatever story they had already fed the room. I studied Renata, the diamonds swaying from her ears. Diamonds purchased with my money. Then I looked at Derek, the son I had hoisted on my shoulders, the boy to whom I had given everything. He could not hold my eyes, his gaze dropping to the polished marble floor. "It is fine, son," I said, my voice dangerously calm and steady. "I understand completely. Do not worry about me." I didn't wait for him to answer. I turned my back on them and walked. The heavy mahogany doors sealed shut behind me, trapping the warmth and the music inside, but I never looked back. My footsteps rang against the stone floor of the lobby. The valet registered clear surprise at seeing me return so soon, but he moved quickly to bring the car around. Stepping out into the freezing Philadelphia night, the cold air struck my face like ice water and snapped everything into sharp focus. I settled into the quiet leather interior of my Mercedes S-Class sedan. The silence of the cabin was absolute. I reached into my pocket and retrieved the velvet box, my thumb tracing the worn fabric. They had not merely turned me away, they had erased me. And then the pieces began to fall into place. The unanswered calls, the vague deflections, the sudden demand for cash, 6 months prior. This was no seating chart error. This was a calculated execution. I drew out my cell phone. The dashboard clock read 7:30 p.m. I dialed the private number of Conrad Ashworth, my lead corporate attorney. He picked up on the second ring. "Gerald, he said, his tone carrying a note of surprise. "Shouldn't you be giving a toast at the Four Seasons Hotel Philadelphia right now, Conrad?" I answered, my voice stripped of all feeling. "Derek just locked me out of the wedding?" A weighted silence settled over the line. The seasoned lawyer needed no further explanation. "What do you need me to do, Gerald?" "Trigger the winter protocol," I said, my eyes fixed on the glowing facade of the hotel through the tinted glass. "Freeze everything. The trust, the accounts, the corporate access. I want every dollar tied to that boy locked down before sunrise. It is done, Gerald, Conrad replied, a dangerous edge sharpening his voice. But you need to see the bank logs first thing tomorrow. They did not just spend the wedding money. They have been digging into the corporate vault. I ended the call and let my head fall back against the leather seat. They believed they had won. They believed they had broken a helpless old man. But come morning, my son and his greedy wife were going to absorb a very painful lesson. You do not lock the wolf out of the house when the wolf is the one who built it. I sat back in this deep leather seat of my Mercedes S-Class sedan. The door closed with a solid thud, sealing out the biting Philadelphia wind and the faint strains of string music spilling from the Four Seasons Hotel Philadelphia lobby. Inside the cabin, silence reigned, broken only by the low hum of the engine. My driver Reuben caught my eye in the rearview mirror. His expression carried a quiet, unspoken concern. He had been behind the wheel for me for over 15 years and knew my schedule down to the minute. He knew I should have been walking Piper down the aisle at this very moment. "Are you all right, Mr. Caldwell?" Reuben asked, his voice gentle and measured. I didn't answer right away. I lifted the velvet box holding Diane's vintage pearl necklace from my pocket and set it gently on the leather seat beside me. The pearls felt impossibly heavy now, as though they had soaked up every ounce of the evening's weight. I smoothed the lapels of my tuxedo and released a long, measured breath. I was not angry. I was not shattered. A strange, absolute calm had descended over me like a fresh coat of frost. "I am perfectly fine, Reuben," I said, keeping my voice completely level. "Drive me to Rittenhouse Square. Take the long route through the city." "Right away, sir," he answered, easing the car into gear and pulling smoothly from the curb. I watched the luminous facade of the hotel recede in the side mirror. My son and daughter-in-law were inside that gilded box, sipping expensive champagne, financed with my money-holding court among the city's elite, while they discarded me into the cold. It was a flawless act of disrespect. But it was not some impulsive eruption. It was a calculated probe. As the car glided through the lit corridors of downtown Philadelphia, I fixed my gaze on the glass towers that defined the Philadelphia financial district. 40 years of my life had been spent conquering this city. Raising Caldwell Global Supply from a single rusting delivery truck into a multi-million-dollar international logistics empire was never a question of luck. It demanded 4 decades of ruthless negotiation, sleepless nights, and an unrelenting hunger to prevail. I surrendered my own youth so my family would never feel the suffocating grip of the poverty I was raised in. I remembered the early years Diane and I crammed into a 1-bedroom apartment. I remembered working back-to-back night shifts, loading pallets with my own bleeding hands, while Derek slept safely in his crib. I bankrolled his elite private schools, his Ivy League education, his sports cars, and his luxury vacations. I wrapped his entire life in a fortress of wealth, completely insulated from hardship. I built that fortress, hoping it would forge a strong, grounded man. Instead, it bred weakness and sharpened his greed. Watching the harbor lights ripple across the dark water, I arrived at the bitter truth. What happened at those ballrooms had nothing to do with a seating chart error or a fire marshal's head count. Renata's sneering expression and Derek's refusal to hold my gaze told a far more deliberate story. They were probing the perimeter, testing the fences to see whether the old man was finally too weak, too tired, or too senile to push back. They assumed my grief over losing Diane had softened my spine. They figured I would go home, cry quietly into my drink, and accept a quiet, forced retirement from the family hierarchy. They calculated I would do anything to avoid a public scandal. They were right about the scandal. I have always despised public theatrics, but they were gravely wrong about my willingness to fold. You do not endure 40 years in the global shipping industry by turning the other cheek when someone puts a blade to your throat. I reached into my breast pocket and retrieved my cell phone. I did not shed one tear. There was no room for grief when survival demanded full attention. I scrolled to the private number of Conrad Ashworth. Conrad was far more than a corporate attorney. He was a legal predator, a man who moved through the treacherous currents of corporate law with a surgeon's precision and a mercenary's ruthlessness. He had been my closest advisor for 2 decades. The line rang exactly twice before he picked up. "Gerald," Conrad said, his deep voice carrying a note of genuine surprise. "I was expecting to hear from you tomorrow. Shouldn't you be delivering the patriarch's speech at the reception right now?" I kept my eyes on the passing streetlights. Conrad Derek locked me out of the wedding. He stopped me at the doors and told me I was not on the list. The silence on his end was complete. Conrad understood the precise power dynamics within my family. He knew the considerable financial contributions I had recently made to sustain Derek's lifestyle and Piper's supposed business ventures. He grasped immediately that this was an act of war. "I see," Conrad said at last, his tone pivoting from easy conversation to cold professional clarity. "What are your instructions, Gerald?" "Trigger the Winter Protocol," I commanded. "Freeze everything." The Winter Protocol was a contingency we had assembled years earlier during a particularly savage, hostile takeover attempt by a rival firm. It was engineered to sever all financial arteries at once. Executing it meant locking down every trust account, every shared corporate credit line, and every piece of collateral connected to the Caldwell estate, cutting off the lifeblood of Derek's lavish existence within moments. "I want the trust frozen." I continued, my voice quiet in the still cabin. "I want the shared company cards deactivated. I want the escrow account holding the $1.2 million placed under an immediate administrative lock. If he tries to buy a pack of gum tomorrow morning, I want his card declined. He wants me out of his life. He can start by paying for his own." I could hear rapid keystrokes on Conrad's end. Even on a Saturday night, he was seated in his home office, ready to mobilize. "Consider it done, Gerald," he said. "I am submitting the electronic freeze requests to the primary financial institutions right now. The blackout will be fully effective before midnight." He did not hang up. I heard him draw a slow, heavy breath. "Gerald," he said, his voice dropping a register. "While I have the banking portal open, I am looking at the transaction logs for the primary corporate holding accounts." He paused. "The protocol is active, but you need to come to my office tomorrow morning. You must see these bank logs with your own eyes. They did not just spend the wedding money, Gerald. They have actually been digging deep into the main corporate vault. We have to act before sunrise." I ended the call and directed Ruben to bring the car around to my Rittenhouse Square residence. The wrought iron gates swung open without a sound, receiving me into a home that now felt vast and hollow. I stepped out, thanked Ruben for his steadfast loyalty, and passed through the heavy oak front doors. The house was entirely dark, lit only by moonlight filtering through the tall windows. I didn't reach for the light switches. I walked straight down the hallway and into my home office. The familiar scent of aged leather and mahogany usually brought comfort, but tonight it offered nothing. I began pacing the length of the antique Aubusson rug, my footsteps beating a steady rhythm against walls lined with decades of corporate honors and framed press clippings. My mind churned, working to unravel the web of deception that had ensnared me. How had a man who spent 40 years anticipating the ruthless maneuvers of global competitors failed to see a betrayal taking root within his own family? The answer was painful and plain. I had shed my armor around my own blood. I allowed myself to be a father rather than a chief executive. It had begun exactly 6 months ago, right here in this very room. The memory replayed with agonizing clarity. I had been seated at my desk, reviewing quarterly projections, when the doors burst open. Derek came in, face-flushed tie, loosened a portrait of a man on the brink of collapse. He dropped into the chair across from me, breathing hard, and slapped a thick stack of manila folders onto the desk. He claimed to have received an advance warning from a contact at the Internal Revenue Service. According to Derek, The agency was launching a sweeping, comprehensive audit on our family trust. He spun a terrifying narrative claiming they were targeting my personal retirement funds and threatening to freeze the entire estate, while the investigation dragged on for years. He said the scrutiny was triggered by an aggressive new tax regulation, and that our traditional corporate shields were temporarily vulnerable. He held my gaze, his hands visibly shaking, and delivered his carefully rehearsed lie. "Dad, they are targeting your retirement funds," he pleaded, his voice fracturing with manufactured desperation. "We need to sign a temporary power of attorney right now. We have to move $1.2 million into a secure escrow account under my name. It is the only way to protect your liquid assets and secure her entire future until the audit ends." Looking back now, the corporate titan in me should have spotted every glaring flaw in his story. I should have called my own accountants. I should have demanded to see official federal notices. I should have summoned Conrad Ashworth immediately. But Derek did not walk into the office of the founder of Caldwell Global Supply. He came to his father. He came to a man still submerged in the quiet, persistent grief of losing his wife. Diane had always been the emotional backbone of our family, the force that held everything together. Without her, I was desperate to keep the remaining pieces intact. When a son arrives at your door, terrified and begging for help to protect his daughter's entire future, the ruthless businessman stands down and the protective father seizes the wheel. I signed the documents because every fiber of my instinct screamed to shield my boy from catastrophe. I wanted to absorb his panic. I wanted to solve the problem, just as I had solved every problem in his life since he was small. I believed I was erecting a protective wall around the family's wealth. What I didn't know was that I was handing him the key to the vault. I authorized the transfer of $1.2 million, convinced it was sailing into safe harbor. I stopped pacing. The heavy stillness of the office hauled me back to the present. The chill of the Philadelphia night seemed to bleed through the window glass and settle into my bones. Derek had turned my protective instinct into a weapon. He had weaponized my love for Piper and my grief for Diane to engineer a massive financial extraction. But the game was far from finished. If Conrad was right about the bank logs, the rabbit hole ran far deeper than a stolen wedding fund. I circled the desk and dropped into my high-backed leather chair. I woke my laptop. The screen threw a harsh blue glow across the darkened room. I logged into my encrypted personal server, moving through layers of security protocols to reach my digital archives. I needed to lay eyes on the document that had launched this entire nightmare, the temporary power of attorney I had signed 6 months ago. My fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, pulling up the scanned file. The document filled the screen, my bold signature anchoring the bottom of the final page. I zoomed in on the fine print, my eyes combing through the legal language with the cold precision of a predator tracking a blood trail. Derek had rushed me through the signing, directing my attention only to the signature lines, insisting the situation demanded immediate action. Now alone in the silence, I read every single word. I scrolled to the notary acknowledgement section. My gaze locked onto the circular seal pressed into the lower corner. A chilling realization struck me like a fist to the sternum. The notary seal on that document did not belong to Langford and Associates, the distinguished corporate law firm that had managed the Caldwell family's affairs for nearly 3 decades. The name on the seal was an entity called Crestline Fiduciary Solutions. It was a generic name, the kind of name designed to sound legitimate while revealing absolutely nothing. I opened a new browser tab and searched the registry of corporate entities. The result came back in seconds. Crestline Fiduciary Solutions was not a law firm. It was not a registered financial institution. It was a shell company incorporated in Delaware just 3 days before Derek had stormed into my office with his fabricated audit story. This had not been a panicked mistake. Every step had been premeditated. He had constructed a dummy corporation, manufactured a fake federal crisis, and brought in a fraudulent notary to legitimize the theft of my assets. He had been engineering the plan to drain me long before he ever planted himself in front of the doors at the Four Seasons Hotel, Philadelphia. Every detail of his performance had been carefully rehearsed to slip beneath my natural corporate defenses. He played me for a fool, gambling that paternal love would blind me to his staggering betrayal. But as I sat staring at that glowing screen, sorrow completely evaporated. In its place came a cold, calculating wrath. The father who had indulged him was gone. The CEO had returned, and I was going to war. I told Conrad I would be at his office by 5 in the morning, and ended the call. I set the phone on the polished mahogany desk and leaned back into the leather chair. The silence of the house pressed against my ears like a physical weight. Digging deep into the main corporate vault, those words from my attorney kept circling through my mind. They had not been satisfied taking the $1.2 million I transferred for my granddaughter's future. They were systematically dismantling the financial foundations of Caldwell Global Supply. My own son was actively raiding the empire I built with my hands. I closed my eyes and released a long, measured breath. The initial shock was dissolving entirely, giving way to a cold, analytical clarity. I needed to reconstruct how they had orchestrated such a sweeping deception right under my nose. I was a man who noticed everything. In business, a misplaced decimal or the slightest hesitation in a vendor's voice was enough to trip my alarm. Yet I had completely missed a multi-million-dollar heist carried out by my own blood. How had they managed to blind me so thoroughly? I opened my eyes and looked at the framed photograph of Diane sitting on the corner of my desk. Her warm, steady smile looked back at me. That was the answer. They had used her. They weaponized my grief and my age to construct a perfect psychological cage around me. The emotional manipulation was far more insidious than the financial theft. They knew I would never question anything framed as protecting the family from unnecessary pain. The second massive lie snapped into place with sickening precision. I cast my mind back to a Tuesday afternoon exactly 3 months ago. The wedding was supposed to be approaching fast, yet the house was strangely quiet. No updates on catering, no venue deposit confirmations, no guest list discussions. As a man who had spent his life managing complex global supply chains, the absence of logistical noise made me instinctively uneasy. I called Derek that morning and asked him to arrange a meeting with the wedding planner. I wanted to review the arrangements personally and make certain Piper was receiving the absolute finest service available. Derek sounded faintly rattled on the phone, offering a vague excuse about the planner being unavailable. 2 hours later, my doorbell rang. It was not Derek or the wedding planner. It was Renata. She walked into my foyer wearing an ivory cashmere wrap and an expression of deep distress. I guided her into the formal living room and offered tea. She declined, perching on the edge of the damask settee with her hands folded tightly in her lap. Her eyes were red-rimmed and glassy. She had the look of a mother carrying an impossible emotional weight. "Dad," she began, her voice trembling with manufactured fragility. "I came because we need to talk about the wedding. Piper is just so incredibly overwhelmed right now. She cries every night and we do not know what to do." I leaned forward immediately, my protective instincts surging. I asked what was wrong, assuming there was a vendor problem or some tension within the bridal party. Renata exhaled shakily and produced one perfect tear that traced a slow path down her cheek. It was a masterful performance. "She does not want a massive spectacle, Dad," Renata said, dabbing her eye. "She is terrified of the stress. All these expectations and grand plans are making her incredibly anxious. She broke down crying last night. She told us she only wants a tiny 20-person backyard dinner with immediate family and close friends. Nothing formal, nothing exhausting?" I sat back, thrown by the sudden reversal. I reminded Renata that I had already committed substantial funds to give Piper a fairy tale event, and that we could bring in additional staff to manage every detail so Piper wouldn't have to lift a finger. But Renata shook her head firmly, reaching out to lay her hand over mine. "It is not just about Piper," she whispered, her voice softening into a tone of rehearsed sympathy. "Dad, we are so incredibly worried about you. You have been so tired lately." Losing Diane took such a massive toll on your heart and your stamina. A grand society wedding with hundreds of guests would be exhausting for you. We cannot bear the thought of putting your health at risk just to host a party. Piper wants it small because she wants you comfortable and safe. We just want to protect you. Sitting in my dark office tonight, I recalled exactly how those poisoned words had landed. They had wrapped their betrayal in a blanket of counterfeit filial devotion. They exploited the devastating loss of my wife to convince me I was a fragile, diminished old man who needed to be shielded from the world. They preyed on my deepest insecurities. Since Diane passed, I had carried a lingering exhaustion that made everything feel heavier. Renata seized on that natural grief and reshaped it into a story of physical and mental decline, making me believe my own granddaughter was scaling back her dreams purely out of concern for my failing health. My reaction that afternoon, 3 months ago now, felt like a blade twisting between my ribs. I had swallowed the lie whole. I had patted Renata's hand and told her not to worry. I said that if Piper wanted a quiet 20-person backyard dinner, that was precisely what she would have. I promised to step back entirely, to stop asking about the planning to leave them to their small, intimate gathering without any pressure from the corporate patriarch. I granted them total, unconditional space. I handed them the cover of darkness they needed to operate beyond my watchful eye. I wrote the check and walked away, convinced I was being a considerate and understanding father. The psychological warfare was brilliantly constructed. By persuading me I was too old and too emotionally brittle to be involved, they neutralized my oversight completely. I stopped asking questions. I stopped requesting receipts. I stopped reaching out to vendors. I sat alone in my quiet house mourning my wife and bracing for a modest backyard dinner. All the while they were using my money to finance an extravagant high-society gala. They exploited my isolation to plunder the family wealth while looking me in the eye and insisting they were safeguarding my fragile heart. The fury now moving through my veins was nothing like the initial shock at the hotel doors. This was deeper, sustained. It was the righteous anger of a man who discovers his compassion has been mocked and his legacy systematically looted by the people he trusted with everything. I rose from my desk and crossed to the tall windows looking out over the moonlit cobblestones of Rittenhouse Square. The scaffolding of their elaborate scheme was collapsing piece by piece. The timeline was impossibly clear. They secured the $1.2 million under the cover of a fabricated federal audit crisis. Then they sent Renata to deliver the story about the intimate 20-person dinner, ensuring I would never appear to inspect the actual preparations. They constructed a towering wall of deception to keep me thoroughly in the dark. For months I had been picturing a simple gathering: paper plates, string lights, something warm and unpretentious in their backyard. I had even bought a new casual suit to match the relaxed setting they had described so vividly. I had drafted a heartfelt speech about the quiet beauty of intimate family moments and the power of simple love. I had trusted them to protect Piper's heart. I genuinely believed they were shielding a young woman from the crushing weight of social expectation. I thought they were being good parents. Instead, they were using her most sacred day as a massive financial smokescreen for their own corporate espionage. They took the purity of her marriage and stained it irreparably with their bottomless greed. Every smile they turned in my direction had been a calculated distraction. Every sympathetic touch was a deliberate misdirection designed to keep me blind to their true intentions and their ultimate aim. But one burning question continued to hover in the still air of my office. It gnawed at the edges of my analytical mind, demanding an answer. I turned the events of the evening over and over, trying to reconcile the conflicting realities. I had literally just left the Four Seasons Hotel Philadelphia in downtown Philadelphia. I had stood before those heavy ballroom doors. I had looked in at hundreds of wealthy guests moving beneath enormous crystal chandeliers. I had caught the scent of thousands of dollars worth of imported floral arrangements. I had witnessed a spectacle of absolute opulence bankrolled entirely with my stolen money. I stared at my own reflection in the dark glass jaw set like stone. If the wedding was genuinely meant to be a small 20-person backyard dinner, arranged to protect my fragile health, why had I just been locked out of a 200-guest black tie gala at the Four Seasons Hotel Philadelphia? The immediate answer to that precise question brought a secondary, far more sinister realization crashing down on me. Sitting in the dim light of my office, my mind began retracing the last several months. I had been consumed by the financial manipulation, the forged documents, the missing $1.2 million. But a far more painful detail suddenly seized my chest. When had I last actually spoken directly with my granddaughter? I scanned through my recent memories, reaching for the sound of Piper's voice. What I found made my stomach drop. It had been nearly 3 full months since we had a direct conversation. Every attempt I made to reach her had been seamlessly intercepted. Whenever I called Piper, her phone rang endlessly before clicking to voicemail. Within minutes of leaving a message, my phone would ring with an incoming call from Renata. She always arrived with a perfectly rehearsed excuse. "Dad, Piper is so sorry she missed your call," Renata would say, her voice wrapped in manufactured warmth. "She is in Europe for a startup retreat. The time difference is brutal, and she is in back-to-back meetings." Weeks later, when I tried again, Renata answered Piper's phone directly. "Gerald, I am just holding her phone for the week," she explained. "Piper is doing a complete digital detox. The wedding planning was causing her massive anxiety, so her therapist recommended she step away from screens entirely. We are just trying to keep her stress levels down." I accepted every one of those excuses without a moment of suspicion. I respected the boundaries they established, because I believed they were genuinely looking after her well-being. I wanted Piper to flourish, to build her business, without the overbearing shadow of her grandfather pressing down on her. I thought I was giving her the room she needed. Instead, I handed them the materials to build an impenetrable fortress around me. They engineered a total communication blackout. Through their relentless fabrications, Derek and Renata severed my only direct line to the person I loved most. They isolated me completely, making certain Piper and I could never compare notes and stumble upon the colossal deception running beneath the surface. It was a classic corporate quarantine tactic flawlessly executed, but I was not entirely without resources. I may be 70 years old, but managing a global logistics empire demands a thorough command of digital intelligence. If they erected a digital wall to keep me out, I only needed to find a back door. I pulled the laptop closer and opened a private browser window. I knew Piper was active on social media, documenting her path as an entrepreneur. I entered her handle and pressed search. The screen loaded not her photo grid, but a blank profile page bearing a simple padlock icon. They had blocked my personal accounts from her page to maintain the quarantine. I refused to let frustration interrupt my momentum. I opened a new tab and navigated to a generic email provider. Within 5 minutes, I had created a completely anonymous email address. I used it to register a brand new, untraceable profile on the platform. I selected a random landscape as the profile image and entered a fictitious name. A burner account, a ghost in the machine, but sufficient leverage to bypass their digital barricade. I typed Piper's handle into the search bar of my anonymous account and hit enter. This time, the firewall crumbled. Her page loaded instantly, revealing a chronological grid of her life. The first thing that caught my eye was the location tags. No cobblestone streets of Europe, no startup retreats in distant time zones. Every single photograph was geotagged right here in the Philadelphia area. I clicked on a post from 6 weeks earlier, right around the period Renata had sworn Piper was overseas. The image showed my granddaughter smiling outside a popular cafe in Chestnut Hill, a coffee cup in hand, the familiar brick facades plainly visible behind her. The caption read, "Loving the autumn vibes in the city today. So much to plan, but so excited for the future." I kept scrolling, the betrayal sharpening with every click. I moved into the stretch when Renata had claimed Piper was in the middle of a strict digital detox. The lie shattered on contact. During that exact 2-week window, Piper had posted nearly every single day. Cake tastings, dress fittings, floral arrangements. She was not retreating from screens she was fully immersed in, planning the very wedding I was funding, while her parents kept me sealed out. I found a photograph of her examining imported white orchids, the precise flowers I had spotted on the invoice. She had been here in the city fully present and engaged while they maintained my complete isolation. The scale of the manipulation was breathtaking. Two entirely separate realities managed with flawless precision. To Piper, they spun a portrait of a bustling, thriving wedding in full swing. To me, they spun a portrait of an overwhelmed, delicate girl who required complete isolation. They positioned themselves squarely between us, commanding the entire flow of information, keeping the money under lock and key, and making certain both sides of the story never touched. As I scrolled toward the present, combing desperately for any trace of the wedding itself, my anger began curdling into something far colder, something that felt like dread. I reached the most recent posts, everything uploaded in the last 48 hours. There were gorgeous shots from the rehearsal dinner, images of laughing bridesmaids, and a video of Derek raising a glass in a toast. But it was the post from yesterday afternoon, less than 24 hours before I stood in my tuxedo at the doors of the Four Seasons Hotel Philadelphia, that drained every drop of warmth from my body. It was a candid photograph of Piper sitting alone beside a window, her gaze drifting soft and distant into the light. The caption beneath that picture read, "So incredibly sad that Grandpa is too sick to make it to my big day tomorrow. He is fighting so hard, and I am praying for his recovery every minute. I love you, Grandpa. I know you will be there in spirit. Sick. Praying for his recovery. Fighting so hard." Those words scorched themselves into my eyes. I am 70 years old, but I am in peak physical condition. I run 3 miles every single morning without exception. I oversee a global corporate portfolio with absolute precision. I am not sick. I am not fighting for my recovery. I sat there staring at that bright screen, my breath snagged in my throat, as the full, horrifying architecture of their deception finally laid itself bare before me. What exactly had my son and his wife told my innocent granddaughter? That question hung in the still air of my office like something with physical mass pressing down against my chest. What story did they feed her to account for my absence? My mind churned through a dozen terrible answers, each uglier than the one before. Did they tell her I was declining fast? Did they tell her I simply didn't love her enough to show up on the most important day of her young life? The calculated emotional brutality of it was almost impossible to fully absorb. I could picture Piper clearly standing in her white dress, eyes drifting toward those heavy ballroom doors, waiting for a grandfather who was never coming. But I couldn't allow myself to stay frozen in that grief. Sorrow is a privilege for those who've already won. I was still standing in the middle of an active battlefield. I needed hard, irrefutable evidence of their financial movements, and I needed it without delay. Derek had operated under the arrogant assumption that he'd completely severed my digital reach into the family's finances. He believed he had efficiently shut me out of the modern banking portals, the sleek financial apps, and the shared trust dashboards we had built together across the past decade. But my son had badly underestimated the institutional knowledge of the man who constructed a global empire with nothing but his own will and his own hands. He had forgotten the bones of Caldwell Global Supply. He had forgotten the legacy servers. Back in the late 90s, when Diane and I first brought our corporate infrastructure into the digital age, we created a master administrative email account. It functioned as a digital failsafe, an archaic master key engineered to automatically receive blind carbon copies of major vendor contracts and high-level financial approvals tied to the original corporate trust architecture. That specific server interface had gone untouched for over 15 years. Derek, being entirely dependent on cloud-based convenience, had never once suspected the ghost server existed. I leaned forward and launched a secure terminal on my laptop. my fingers tracing the ancient web address from nothing but deep muscle memory. I entered the long alphanumeric password I had carried in my mind for 2 decades. The screen blinked black for a half-second before a painfully antiquated gray interface materialized. It felt like descending into a digital crypt, but the system was fully alive. I clicked into the master administrative inbox. My heart hammered hard against my ribs as endless rows of automated text began flooding the screen. There were tens of thousands of unread automated logs waiting there, but I had no intention of sifting through all of them. I typed a handful of targeted keywords into the search bar. 4 Seasons, Hotel Philadelphia. Wedding, Derek, escrow. The old system ground through the query for a few excruciating seconds, its processing icon turning with agonizing slowness. Then a single forwarded email surfaced at the top of the results. It was an automated receipt, generated by a primary vendor, and pushed through our old trust approval matrix simply because Derek had been careless enough to use the original routing numbers attached to the escrow account he had pressured me to fund. I opened the message, and a high-resolution document filled my screen. It was an official invoice from an elite luxury florist situated in the most affluent shopping corridor in Philadelphia. I fixed my gaze on the bold figures printed at the bottom. The total billed for a single evening came to exactly $45. I eased back in my heavy leather chair and let out a laugh, harsh, hollow, utterly devoid of humor, that rang off the silent office walls. $45,000. The itemized breakdown described hundreds of imported white orchids, cascading floral ceiling arches, and custom silver table centerpieces commissioned for a massive ballroom. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of their lie was absolutely staggering. Just 3 months ago, Renata had sat on the edge of my damask settee, dabbing at those delicate, perfectly timed tears. She had sworn to my face that Piper was suffering from crippling social anxiety. She had rendered a remarkably convincing portrait of a tiny 20-person backyard gathering paper plates, rustic string lights, nothing more. She had looked me dead in the eyes and weaponized my own love for my granddaughter to keep me quietly sealed inside my home. But you do not spend $45,000 on imported white orchids for a quiet family barbecue. You spend that kind of money when you are dressing a grand luxury ballroom to dazzle the most powerful and wealthy people in the city. The tidy fiction they had assembled collapsed completely in a single instant. The fragile narrative they had spoon-fed me so carefully to guarantee my isolation was nothing more than a cheap theatrical performance. My gut, that raw, primal instinct that had kept me standing in the ruthless corporate arena for 40 long years, had been right the entire time. The $1.2 million I had wired into Derek's account was never meant to shield my assets from a fabricated federal audit. It was never meant to fund Piper's new business venture or give her a modest foundation in life. It was a systematic, large-scale extraction of my wealth executed right beneath my trusting nose. They had stolen my life savings to stage the social event of the decade, all while presenting me to the outside world as a fragile, senile old man, too sick and too confused to step beyond his own front door. I turned back to the glowing screen and traced the line items on the floral invoice as a cold, dangerous clarity took hold. My eyes moved past the obscene charges for crystal vases and decorative silk drapery. I scrolled to the billing details section at the bottom of the document. I needed to see precisely how Derek had routed that massive payment to the florist. The moment I read the typed address, the air left my lungs. The cold logic of the situation cracked open, exposing a truth far more terrifying and dangerous than vanity or ordinary greed. The billing address on the $45,000 floral invoice did not belong to the Four Seasons Hotel Philadelphia. It did not belong to Derek and Renata's sprawling suburban estate. It did not even belong to the dummy shell company they had exploited to extract the fraudulent power of attorney from me. The address, printed in crisp black ink, sat on Market Street, right at the pulsing center of the Philadelphia financial district. I recognized it the moment I saw it drawn from decades of corporate warfare. It belonged to an elite, ferociously aggressive venture capital firm, one known globally for executing hostile takeovers and stripping legacy companies to their bones. They were absolute predators who devoured vulnerable family businesses without a trace of mercy. Why in the world was my own flesh and blood son routing a massive wedding floral invoice through a ruthless venture capital firm that specialized exclusively in destroying corporate empires? That question suspended itself in the cold air of my office like a guillotine waiting to drop. Venture capital firms of that predatory nature have no interest in imported orchids or luxury weddings. They care about hostile takeovers. They care about liquidating assets and dismantling legacy companies piece by piece. Caldwell Global Supply was a privately held fortress. I held the absolute controlling interest. There was only one way a firm like that could ever lay hands on my company. They would need the controlling shareholder to voluntarily step aside, or they would need the controlling shareholder to be declared legally incompetent to manage his own affairs. That single terrifying thought was the master key that cracked open a deeply unsettling memory from just 2 weeks prior. The fragments of their sinister puzzle began slamming together in my mind with brutal force. I pulled back from the glowing laptop screen as the memory rolled over me, so vivid and so chilling that my pulse hammered hard against my temples. 2 weeks ago, Derek had come to the house under the guise of a routine Sunday morning coffee. Renata was with him, hovering at his side with that same cloying manufactured concern she had deployed so effectively as a weapon. They settled me down at the kitchen island, and Derek laid his hand over mine. He wore an expression of profound, agonizing worry. He told me that he and Renata had been watching me closely in the time since Diane passed away. He said I had been repeating myself mid-conversation. He claimed I was leaving doors unlocked, losing track of minor corporate details, and drifting off into vacant stares for hours at a stretch. He painted a portrait of a man rapidly losing his grasp on reality. I pushed back hard. I told them I was perfectly fine, tired, yes, and grieving, but fine. Then Renata stepped in, her voice trembling with that signature counterfeit emotion. She announced they had already taken the liberty of booking a full cognitive evaluation at Jefferson University Hospital. She dressed it up as a simple routine checkup, just to give the whole family some peace of mind ahead of the wedding stress. They insisted they would not hear any objection. They boxed me in with their manufactured love, making me feel like a stubborn, aging burden if I refused to go along. So I went. I sat in a sterile, harshly lit examination room at Jefferson University Hospital while a highly regarded neurologist put me through an extensive battery of cognitive tests. I answered memory prompts, worked through complex spatial reasoning exercises, and walked the doctor through my daily routine in precise detail. Derek and Renata waited out in the corridor, supposedly wringing their hands with dread over my deteriorating mental state. After nearly 2 hours of rigorous testing, the neurologist offered a warm smile and handed me my file. My cognitive function was completely flawless, he told me. Sharp as a man half my age, he said, memory retention in the highest possible percentile. He confirmed there was absolutely zero evidence of dementia, Alzheimer's, or any form of cognitive decline. A massive wave of relief had moved through me. I thanked the doctor, gathered my coat, and stepped out into the corridor to share the good news with my son and daughter-in-law. I anticipated tears of joy. I expected open arms and a long exhale of collective relief from the family that had been so breathlessly worried about my health. But as I came through the examination room door, I didn't immediately call out to them. I caught their reflection in the heavy glass panel of the adjacent clinic. They were standing near the elevator bank exchanging furious whispers. They had not noticed me approaching. I studied their faces in the glass, and what I saw turned my blood to ice. There was no relief on Derek's face. What I saw was pure, undisguised fury. His jaw was locked so tight the muscles along his cheek stood out in sharp relief. His face flushed a deep, angry red. Renata was clutching his arm, eyes wide with unmistakable panic. She was shaking her head in rapid little movements, her mouth forming urgent words I couldn't make out through the glass. They had the look of two conspirators watching their master plan unravel in real time. The moment I pushed through the door and announced my clean bill of health, their faces rearranged themselves instantly. The rage evaporated, replaced by stiff, visibly forced smiles and hollow words of congratulation. At the time, I had explained away their strange reaction as leftover stress. I told myself they were simply wrung out from the emotional weight of the hospital visit. But sitting here now, armed with the knowledge of the Shell Corporation, the looted wedding funds, and a predatory venture capital firm's fingerprints on the whole scheme, the truth was blinding in its clarity. Why would a son be furious to learn his 70-year-old father has no trace of dementia? Why would a daughter-in-law panic at the news of my perfect cognitive health? Because they needed me to be sick. They desperately needed that doctor to stamp me as mentally unfit. Had I failed that cognitive exam, Derek would have wielded the fraudulent power of attorney he had tricked me into signing to seize immediate total control of Caldwell Global Supply. He would have used a medical diagnosis to circumvent the board of directors entirely and deliver the keys of my empire straight to the venture capital firm on Market Street. The $1.2 million was nothing more than a down payment on their corporate treason. The fictitious backyard dinner was engineered to keep me isolated and blind while they closed the hostile takeover behind my back. They were trying to erase me medically, legally, completely. My hands were trembling not from fear, but from a towering and righteous fury. I turned back to the laptop. If they were willing to go that far to fabricate a diagnosis, they would not have abandoned the effort after one failed hospital visit. They would have hunted for another opening, another vulnerability, to exploit somewhere in my medical history. I opened a fresh browser tab and went directly to the secure patient portal for my primary healthcare provider. I entered my credentials, cleared the two-factor authentication on my phone, and pulled up my private medical dashboard. The portal held decades of records, including the intensive grief counseling sessions I had attended in the raw weeks after Diane died. Those sessions were deeply confidential, cataloging my most vulnerable moments, my darkest passages of loss and depression. I moved away from the main health summary and clicked the Security and Access Log tab at the bottom of the screen. The system produced a detailed record of every instance my files had been accessed, requested, or viewed. I scrolled past my own recent login and the authorized timestamps from my primary care physician. Then my gaze locked onto a cluster of unauthorized activity from 3 days ago. 3 distinct, aggressive attempts to break through the security firewall and download my complete psychiatric evaluation records. The system had blocked each one and logged the source of the intrusion. I highlighted the numeric IP address beside the failed attempts and ran it through a basic network tracing tool. The physical location tied to that address appeared on the screen in bright red text. It didn't originate from a hospital. It didn't originate from an insurance company. It originated from the residential network hub registered to Derek and Renata's sprawling suburban home. The digital trail staring back at me from that monitor was the final absolute confirmation I required. My own son and daughter-in-law had not only pillaged my finances, they were actively working to strip away my autonomy. They were building a fabricated paper trail piece by deliberate piece to rob me of my rights and my freedom. I sat in the stillness of my office as the darkness gave way to morning. I felt no exhaustion. My adrenaline was a cold, precise fuel. Decades ago, when a corporate rival tried to bankrupt me, I didn't answer with rage. I let them believe they were winning while I quietly bought their supply chain out from under them. That was the strategy I needed now. A direct confrontation was out of the question. The moment they knew I had uncovered the conspiracy, they would accelerate their timeline without hesitation. They had already proven capable of manufacturing a full-blown crisis. I needed to hand them a convincing illusion of total victory so their guard would fall completely. I walked into the adjoining bathroom and ran cold water over my face. I studied the man in the mirror and rehearsed the posture of the frail figure they were so hungry for me to become. I let my shoulders sag, I softened my gaze, allowing a vacant, drifting expression to settle across my features. I cleared my throat until it sounded raw and faint. I was 70, and though I ran 3 miles every morning, I knew precisely how to perform frailty. I returned to the office and picked up my phone. It was past 8 in the morning. Derek and Renata would be waking up with champagne hangovers, basking in the warm glow of their stolen triumph. I drew one final slow breath to steady my pulse and pressed my son's name on the screen. The line rang 3 times before it connected. "Hello?" Derek answered, his voice thick with sleep and edged with a faint guardedness. He was bracing for an angry confrontation about the Four Seasons Hotel Philadelphia doors. I gave him no such opening. Instead, I exhaled a long, unsteady sigh and let my voice come out small and confused. "Son," I whispered, threading a note of desperate disorientation through my tone. "Son, is that you? I am confused. Did the wedding happen already? I think I sat down after dinner last night and just fell asleep. Did I miss Piper's big day? Before we go any further, what I was about to piece together about my own son would shake something loose in me that never quite settled back. It cost more than I can easily say. And I want to ask you this: if you suspected someone close to you had been quietly working against you, would you confront them the moment you knew, or would you wait and build your case in silence?" A sharp, stunned silence fell over the other end of the line. I could almost hear the gears turning in his head. He had steeled himself for an enraged corporate titan demanding answers about hotel security. Instead, he was receiving a pathetic, senile old man who couldn't even recall leaving his own house. I squeezed my eyes shut and forced a crack into my voice. "I am so sorry, Derek." I went on, sounding absolutely wrecked and completely beaten down. I laid out my suit, but I just felt so exhausted. My head has been so terribly foggy. Please tell me I did not ruin the small backyard dinner. When Derek finally responded, every trace of defensive tension had drained out of his voice, instantly swapped for a thick, syrupy layer of condescension. "Oh, Dad," he sighed, adopting the patient tone of a parent addressing a confused toddler. "It is completely fine. We were wondering where you were, but Renata figured you were probably worn out from all the grief. You have been so confused lately." I pressed my grip into the edge of my desk until my knuckles went white. But I kept my voice perfectly small and pitiful. "Was it beautiful?" I asked, my words coming out frail and uncertain. "Did she have a quiet time in the backyard?" "It was perfect, Dad," Derek replied, the lie rolling effortlessly off his tongue. "Just 20 people, very simple, very quiet. Piper wore a cotton dress, and we had a family barbecue. She missed you, of course, but she understood. We all know you are not yourself these days. You need to rest. Stop worrying about anything complex or stressful." I wanted to scream. I wanted to throw the $45,000 floral invoice in his face and describe 200 guests swaying beneath crystal chandeliers while I sat alone in the dark. I wanted to hurl the phone against the wall, but I played the senile fool precisely as they required. "I am just so tired, son," I murmured, letting my voice dissolve into a weak and trembling whisper. "I do not know what is wrong with my old memory. I feel like I am losing my mind. Thank you for understanding. Thank you for handling everything for me." "Do not worry about a single thing, Dad," Derek said, his tone swelling with arrogant satisfaction. "Renata and I have everything completely under control. Just stay in the house and rest. We will swing by in a few days and sort out your new schedule. Just relax." I thanked him over and over, apologizing for my failing memory before saying goodbye. I waited for the clean, electronic click of the call ending, but it never came. Derek, dulled by his hangover, had pulled the phone away from his ear without pressing the red button to properly disconnect. The line stayed open. I stood completely still in my home office, barely drawing breath. Through the tiny speaker came the ambient sounds of his master bedroom, the rustle of expensive silk sheets, the soft, heavy thud of his phone landing on a wooden nightstand. Then I heard Renata's voice, muffled but unmistakably clear. "Was that him?" she asked, her tone sharp and immediately alert. "Was he furious about the security guards last night?" I pressed the phone hard against my ear. Derek let out a cruel, booming laugh that sent a wave of cold, physical revulsion straight through me. "Furious?" Derek scoffed, his voice thick with victorious contempt. "He does not even remember going to the hotel. He thinks he dozed off in his reading chair and missed a simple backyard barbecue. I told you the isolation would wear him down." He was crying, apologizing for his memory. "He is completely lost." There was a brief, agonizing pause, and then Renata exhaled a long, deeply satisfied sigh. "It is perfect," she said, her voice smooth and unhurried. "I was so worried we would have to fight him on the corporate power transfer, but this development makes everything so much simpler. The old man's mind is finally going soft, exactly the way we needed." I sat with my eyes closed, absorbing every drop of the toxic venom in their casual morning exchange. They were celebrating my supposed mental collapse. They were savoring the illusion that I had become a broken, defenseless creature, one no longer capable of protecting himself or defending what he had built. "Call the clinic," Derek said, his voice snapping, suddenly cold and efficient. "Tell them we are moving the timeline up immediately. There is no reason to wait until the end of the month. He is completely compliant. Tell them we are coming in to sign the permanent guardianship papers, and then we move him for good on Tuesday." The line went dead. I slowly brought the phone down from my ear and set it flat on my mahogany desk. I sat motionless in the silence for a long stretch of time. The full, crushing weight of their betrayal settled into my bones. "We move him on Tuesday." The words bounced off the quiet walls of the room. They had plotted the complete erasure of my autonomy. Within 48 hours, they intended to strip away my legal standing, force me into a psychiatric facility, and lock me away behind the cover story of cognitive decline. They meant to bury me alive. The shock of their cruelty burned away, leaving behind a deep, terrifying calm in its place. I was no longer a grieving widower, and I was no longer an indulgent father. I was the founder of Caldwell Global Supply, and my own son had launched a hostile takeover of my life. I went upstairs, showered and dressed in my tailored charcoal suit. I knotted my silk tie with measured, deliberate care. I took the keys to the heavy sedan and drove through the empty, mist-dampened city streets. The roads glistened under the pale, early light. My mind operated at full capacity, calculating angles, anticipating their next moves. I arrived at the tower that housed Ashworth and Associates shortly before 500 in the morning. The lobby was vacant, except for a single security guard, who offered a wordless nod as I swiped my access card at the private elevator bank. The doors slid closed, and I rose to the 42nd floor. The elevator chimed softly, and I stepped out into the hushed reception area. Conrad Ashworth was already standing in the main corridor. He had on a crisp white shirt with the sleeves pushed up, and his dark eyes were absolutely alert. We had weathered far too many corporate battles together for hollow pleasantries. He motioned for me to follow him, and led me straight into a secure, soundproof conference room at the far end of the executive suite. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind us, sealing the room completely. The long glass table was buried under thick stacks of financial documents, bank logs, and legal folios. Conrad poured 2 cups of black coffee from a silver carafe and slid one across the glass to me. I sat down and laid out everything. I walked him through the overheard phone call, the massive floral invoice tied to the venture capital firm, and the chilling exchange I had just listened to regarding the clinic and the Tuesday deadline. Conrad absorbed it all with the composed expression of a seasoned general receiving a battlefield report. He took a slow sip of his coffee, letting the full scope of the treachery settle. When I finished, Conrad set his cup down and reached for a thick manila folder sitting at the center of the table. "Gerald," he said, his voice dropping to a low, deliberate register, You and I have come through corporate espionage, federal investigations, and brutal market collapses together. Do you honestly think I would allow you to sign away your sovereign wealth without a significant insurance policy in place? He opened the folder and withdrew a copy of the temporary power of attorney that Derek had pressured me into signing 6 months ago. The document appeared exactly as I remembered it. Conrad flipped past the first dozen pages and stopped at page 48. He smoothed the paper against the table and directed my attention to a dense paragraph buried deep within the legal architecture. When Derek brought this document into your office, Conrad explained his delivery precise as a surgeon's incision. He thought he was being incredibly clever. He assumed he could rush you into signing a blanket authorization by exploiting your instincts as a father. But your son completely failed to realize that our firm builds every piece of family estate paperwork with interlocking contingency clauses. I embedded a specific poison pill right here in subsection 9. I leaned in and studied the text. The legal language was dense, but Conrad translated it without hesitation. The clause explicitly states that any unilateral transfer of funds exceeding $100,000 to any offshore entity or unauthorized holding account requires your physical biometric thumbprint authorization. Should the designated proxy attempt to force a transfer of that magnitude without your physical presence, the power of attorney is instantly and permanently invalidated. I stared at him as the full brilliance of what he had done washed over me. You built a tripwire, I whispered. Exactly. Conrad gave a single nod, a predatory smile crossing his face. It is a silent alarm. The instant Derek attempted to move the $1.2 million, the banking system flagged the transaction. It allowed the transfer to process on the surface, handing him a false sense of victory, but it simultaneously triggered a total administrative freeze across every single asset tied to his name. The trap snapped shut the moment he hit that button. He believes he won, I said, the cold weight of it settling over me. He thinks he has the authority to have me declared incompetent by Tuesday because he assumes the document is still active. Conrad nodded. He is operating under a completely shattered illusion. The document is void. He holds absolutely no legal authority over your health, your estate, or your corporate holdings. He cannot move you to any clinic, and he cannot touch your shares. The power of attorney self-destructed the instant he tried to steal the money. We handed him enough rope to hang himself, and he sprinted straight for the gallows. We sat in silence for a beat. My son had walked directly into our trap, his own arrogance blinding him every step of the way. He had spent the last 6 months congratulating himself on a flawless heist, never suspecting he was standing on a financial landmine. The corporate machinery I had spent 4 decades constructing was still shielding me, even as my own blood worked to tear it down. But there remained one final piece to account for. The poison pill had neutralized Derek's legal power, yet the funds had still moved on the surface. The money had been routed before the freeze could lock every account down completely. The floral invoice confirmed that Derek had been actively draining the trust, but the connection to the venture capital firm pointed to something far more elaborate. If the money wasn't going toward the wedding, and it wasn't sitting in Piper's business account, where exactly had my son diverted my life savings? I looked across at Conrad. The trap worked, I said, keeping my voice level. But where did the money actually go? Conrad's expression shifted, the predatory smile gone, replaced by something grave and measured. He reached down to the leather briefcase at his feet and drew out a sleek black dossier. He placed it carefully on the glass table, his hand resting firmly on the cover. We spent the entire night tracing the digital routing numbers. Conrad said, his voice barely above a whisper. Derek did not simply wire that money to himself, Gerald. He did not use it to settle personal debts, and he most certainly did not secure it for your granddaughter. He pushed the black dossier slowly across the polished glass until it came to rest directly in front of me. Gerald, Conrad said, his eyes finding mine with absolute gravity, look at where he sent the $1.2 million. I opened the heavy black cover. The first page held a complex flowchart, a labyrinth of international wire transfers laid out in stark detail. Conrad reached over and pressed a finger to a specific red box at the very end of the digital trail. The $1.2 million had not simply dissolved into the domestic banking system. It had been bounced through 3 separate proxy accounts in Delaware and Nevada before crossing the ocean. It came to rest in a secure, untraceable offshore account in the Cayman Islands. The holding company registered to that account bore the name Harlow Crest Holdings. The name meant nothing to me on first reading, but Conrad turned to the next page laying out the corporate registration documents his elite private investigators had retrieved. The managing director of Harlow Crest Holdings was listed as Renata Loring. Loring was Renata's maiden name. My son had circumvented the traditional safeguards of our family trust by using his wife's premarital identity to establish an offshore shell company. They had meticulously engineered the panic around a fictitious federal audit for the sole purpose of funneling my life savings into an account sitting entirely beyond the reach of United States tax authorities. I stared at the offshore banking records as a cold fury settled over my thoughts. But the money was only the beginning of what they had built. I turned the page and found a detailed guest list from the event at the Four Seasons Hotel, Philadelphia. I looked at Conrad, demanding an explanation for the sheer volume of wealthy strangers I had observed through those glass doors. Conrad leaned back in his chair, his expression heavy. "Gerald," he said, his voice even and deliberate. "That gathering at the hotel was not a wedding reception. Piper and her husband had a brief 15-minute ceremony in the courtyard, but the massive event filling the grand ballroom was something else altogether. It was a corporate networking gala. Derek used the $45,000 in imported white orchids and hundreds of thousands in catering to throw an extravagant party for the most aggressive venture capitalists in the Northeast. He used his granddaughter's wedding as a glittering, spectacular smokescreen to court the exact predators who are positioning themselves to dismantle Caldwell Global Supply. I looked down at the list. Every name on it belonged to a ruthless corporate liquidator, a hostile takeover specialist, or a partner at the Market Street venture capital firm. Derek had charged the entire evening to the corporate accounts using my money to host a lavish banquet for the very people preparing to demolish everything I had built. He made certain I stayed home isolated by grief and expecting a modest backyard dinner so that I would never witness him shaking hands with the enemy. He had paraded his daughter in her white dress to project an image of perfect family stability, convincing the investors that the Caldwell empire was ripe for the taking and that he was firmly the man in command. The magnitude of the betrayal made the air inside that soundproof conference room feel impossibly thin. I drew a long breath, forcing my lungs to work. "Why are they courting liquidators?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, barely audible whisper. "Yaka, if Derek wants to take over the company, why is he inviting the very people who will tear it apart and sell it off for scraps?" Conrad slid another heavily redacted document across the glass. "Because he does not want to run your company, Gerald. He never wanted to load shipping containers, manage international logistics, or sit across from port authorities. He only wants the money." He let that land before continuing. "This is a preliminary letter of intent drafted by the Market Street firm. Derek has spent the last 6 months quietly negotiating the total liquidation of Caldwell Global Supply. He agreed to sell the entire enterprise out from underneath you for exactly $50 million. I stared at the figures on that crisp white page. $50 million. It was a fraction of what the company actually commanded, a fire sale price engineered to guarantee a fast, uncontested buyout. Derek had understood that even with a fabricated psychiatric hold, the board of directors would eventually expose his inadequacy if he tried to operate a global logistics empire. He knew he could never fill my shoes. So rather than attempt to lead the company, he chose to dismantle it entirely. His scheme was to secure the power of attorney, have me locked away in a secured medical facility by Tuesday, and immediately authorize the hostile sale of my life's work. Once the $50 million landed in his accounts, he and Renata were going to sweep the entire sum into the Cayman Islands shell company. Conrad confirmed what I already feared most. They have already purchased one-way first-class tickets, Gerald. The moment the liquidation funds clear, they are flying directly to a non-extradition country in South America. They intend to live like royalty on a stolen fortune, leaving you confined to a psychiatric ward to deteriorate in isolation and confusion. They were going to strip away my company, my wealth, and my freedom, then disappear into the tropical sun without a single moment of remorse. I slowly closed the heavy black cover of the dossier. The full picture was assembled now, every piece in its place. My own son was a traitor of the highest order. He had weaponized my love, exploited the raw grief of losing Diane, and manipulated my innocent granddaughter, all to engineer what he believed was the perfect crime. He was convinced he had successfully navigated the treacherous waters of corporate law and emerged on the other side holding all the cards. He fully expected that by tomorrow he would be clutching a $50 million check while I was sedated in a locked ward. I looked across the glass table at Conrad. The seasoned attorney held my gaze, waiting for my instruction. The founder of Caldwell Global Supply did not panic. A surge of cold, concentrated energy moved through me. The sorrow and the grief had been completely burned away, consumed by the white-hot urgency of what had to happen next. When exactly is the final sale scheduled to be executed? I asked, my voice carrying the full weight of a man who has decided on total war. Conrad glanced at the heavy gold watch on his left wrist. The Market Street venture capital firm is opening their offices specifically for this transaction. The final liquidation documents are scheduled to be signed on Monday at exactly 9 in the morning. I rose from the conference table and fastened the button on my tailored charcoal jacket. I smoothed my silk tie, feeling the familiar, steadying weight of command settle back across my shoulders. The trap was fully set, the timeline had been exposed, and the enemy was at that moment sleeping off a champagne hangover, completely unaware that their master plan had been thoroughly dismantled. I had spent 40 years constructing an empire from a single rusting delivery truck. I knew every vulnerability, every legal loophole, and every concealed pressure point within my own corporation. I looked Conrad Ashworth in the eyes. I have exactly 24 hours to destroy his empire. Let us get to work. Conrad opened his laptop, the harsh glow cutting sharp lines across his tired face. We did not squander a single second. The clock was counting down to the Monday morning meeting at the venture capital firm, and we had an enormous amount of complex legal restructuring to complete before dawn broke over the Philadelphia skyline. Derek believed he had successfully paralyzed my corporate authority, operating on the assumption that the fraudulent power of attorney and my supposed mental deterioration gave him unchallenged control over Caldwell Global Supply. He had convinced himself that a global logistics company is fundamentally defined by its vast warehouses, its fleet of trucks, and its physical inventory. But Derek had never troubled himself to understand the true underlying architecture of what I had actually built. He was a creature of surface appearances, perpetually blinded by the illusion of tangible physical assets. The genuine, unassailable value of Caldwell Global Supply did not live in the steel shipping containers or the international distribution centers spread across the globe. The true $50 million valuation rested entirely in our proprietary routing algorithms, the highly customized supply chain management software, and a closely guarded portfolio of international logistics patents. Those digital assets were the invisible nervous system that kept the entire global operation running with flawless precision. Without that specific software, the delivery trucks would sit idle. The automated warehouses would seize up entirely, and the international shipping routes would collapse into complete, irreversible chaos. Decades ago, when I first recognized the sweeping digital revolution bearing down on the global shipping industry, I made a crucial and entirely private legal move. I formally separated the intellectual property from the primary corporate structure. I registered every algorithm, every line of proprietary code, and every core patent under a highly restricted founder designation. Derek had arrogantly assumed he was selling a fully operational, enormously profitable gold mine to the predatory liquidators on Market Street. He had confidently promised them the keys to a kingdom he did not actually possess. He had no idea whatsoever that I retained the absolute unchallengeable authority to revoke the licensing rights to that essential operating software at any moment of my choosing. I was about to transform his $50 million gold mine into an empty, worthless shell. "Conrad," I said, stripping every trace of emotion from my voice, "draft the immediate transfer protocols right now. I want every patent, every registered copyright, and all the proprietary logistics software completely removed from the Caldwell Global Supply corporate umbrella. Immediately." "Where are we moving them?" Conrad asked, his fingers already moving across the illuminated keyboard with practiced lethal speed. "Lock into a brand new, fully insulated holding entity." I replied, my gaze fixed on the dark city beyond the glass. "Register it immediately in Delaware. Name it Summit Crest Holdings. Put it solely and exclusively in my name, 0 external beneficiaries, 0 proxy access. Nobody touches these digital assets without my physical signature." Conrad gave a single nod, eyes locked on his glowing screen as he began executing the massive digital transfer. For the next 5 hours, that secure, soundproof conference room held nothing but the rapid percussion of keyboard keys and the quiet rustle of dense, heavily redacted legal documents. We worked in complete silence, moving with the seamless, unspoken coordination of two men who had fought and won countless brutal corporate battles together over the past 20 years. We initiated emergency digital notarizations, formally transferred the international intellectual property licenses, and legally severed the operating software from the main corporate body. We systematically hollowed out the very core of the company, extracting its beating digital heart, and leaving behind only a hollow, useless physical shell. The entire process was completely undetectable to anyone operating within the standard corporate framework. It was a surgical strike carried out with absolute precision. By the time the first pale light of morning began bleeding through the tall glass windows of the executive suite, the massive corporate extraction was fully finalized. Conrad pressed the final execution key, securely logged out of the global registry, and leaned back in his leather chair, pressing his fingers against his exhausted eyes. "It is officially done, Gerald," he said, releasing a long, heavy breath that settled across the quiet room. "Summit Crest Holdings is now live, fully registered, and completely impenetrable. Every piece of proprietary routing software and every logistics patent is locked away under your exclusive legal control. Caldwell Global Supply has been officially stripped of its intellectual property. If Derek moves to finalize the corporate sale Monday morning, he will be handing over an empty shell. The venture capital firm will run their final due diligence, discover the software licenses have vanished overnight, and the entire $50 million acquisition will collapse on the spot. They will tear him apart when they realize he attempted to sell them a functionally worthless company." I stared at the towering stacks of transfer documents piled on the polished glass table. A deep, icy satisfaction settled into my chest, easing the crushing weight that had pressed against me through the night. The financial blockade was airtight. The corporate defense was impenetrable. I had shielded the lifeblood of my life's work from my own treacherous son. The predators on Market Street would walk away with nothing, and Derek would be left holding nothing but ash. But as the adrenaline slowly drained from my veins, leaving a cold, sharp ache in its place, a dark and deeply unsettling realization began to take root in the back of my mind. Destroying his illicit corporate sale and cutting off his offshore financial access was purely a matter of ruthless business strategy. It protected my assets and secured my company, but it did not deliver true, permanent justice. Derek had deliberately conspired to strip away my fundamental freedom, cruelly isolate me from my granddaughter, and have me locked inside a secured psychiatric ward to disappear in silence. He was actively planning to steal my entire life and evaporate into the tropical sun. Simply blocking the financial sale was nowhere near sufficient to stop him permanently. The patents and algorithms were fully secured, but I needed something far more powerful to put my own son behind bars where he truly belonged for the remainder of his miserable life. I needed a verified, irrefutable confession. I needed to know the exact lie he had confidently fed to those venture capitalists to justify liquidating my empire without my presence or consent. I needed to hear him declare his treason out loud in a manner he could never deny before a court of law. I turned toward Conrad, the pale morning light throwing long, angular shadows across the polished glass table. The time for passive defensive maneuvering had come to a definitive end. I need to get him in a secured room with those investors. I stated, my voice perfectly level in the stillness of the office. I need to stand in the shadows and hear him hang himself with his own words. I need a full confession to bring his false empire down once and for all. Conrad did not hesitate. He understood completely that what I was asking for was not rooted in emotional vengeance, but in the absolute necessity of total legal destruction. He reached across the desk and pressed a single button on his secure intercom system. He instructed his security liaison to bring the associate up. Less than 5 minutes later, the heavy oak door of the conference room swung open. A man entered the room. He wore a gray suit that rendered him practically invisible in any setting. This was Dorian Conrad's lead private investigator, a former federal operative who specialized in deep corporate espionage and the invisible retrieval of compromised assets. Dorian offered no greeting. He simply crossed to the table and set a matte black flash drive precisely in front of me. He regarded me with an expression of steady, unwavering professional respect. He explained that when Conrad had first detected the unauthorized wire transfer into the escrow account, he had immediately deployed a covert surveillance team to the Four Seasons Hotel Philadelphia. They knew the grand ballroom had been booked for a luxury event, but they needed to establish exactly what was being negotiated behind those closed doors. Dorian described how one of his most seasoned undercover operatives had successfully embedded within the luxury catering staff. While circulating with champagne and passing expensive hors d'oeuvres, the operative had slipped a military-grade listening device beneath the heavy mahogany table in the primary VIP lounge adjoining the main ballroom. That specific lounge had been reserved exclusively for Derek and the senior partners of the Market Street venture capital firm. What that small black drive held was a raw, completely unedited audio recording, their intensely private, premature pre-sale celebration captured in full. I reached across the table and lifted it. The weight of it in my shaking hand was all wrong, impossibly dense, for something so small as though the proof of everything I had lost had compressed itself into a sliver of metal. I thanked Conrad and Dorian for their flawless execution and walked out of the law firm as the morning sun finally broke over the horizon. Then I pointed the sedan toward home, toward that sprawling, painfully silent property I could no longer bring myself to call anything warm. The great stone house stood utterly vacant. Every corridor, every room, a vast resonant shell of the life Diane and I had constructed together over decades now, given over entirely to the hollow truth of what my son had done. I went straight to my wood-paneled study and drew the heavy double doors shut without looking back. I left the overhead lights off. The room was lit only by what thin, pale daylight managed to press through the thick curtains. Moving on instinct, I crossed to the antique crystal decanter on the polished side table. My hands did not shake as I filled a heavy tumbler with a generous pour of aged single malt scotch. I stood motionless in the half-dark, watching the liquid hold the dim glow, giving myself a moment to brace against the weight of what I was about to hear. There was no undoing this. Once I pressed play on whatever lived inside that drive, the last thread connecting me to my son as a father, not as a victim, would be gone. Gone, too, would be any lingering hope that Derek's actions were the product of panic or weakness. What I was about to confirm was that the child I had clothed, sheltered, and fought for across every year of his life had grown into something cold and deliberate. A man who had priced me out and decided I was worth more as an obstacle removed than as a father honored. I drew a slow sip of the scotch, let it burn through me, and settled into the leather chair behind my executive desk. The flash drive slid into the laptop's side port. A decryption window demanded the alphanumeric sequence Conrad had supplied. I entered each character carefully, each keystroke measured and exact. The bar turned green. A single audio file resolved on the dark screen, named for nothing more than the date of the wedding and the location of the VIP lounge. No drama in the label, just coordinates to a moment that would end my old life. I rested the cursor over the play icon and did nothing for a long moment. The study was absolutely still. From somewhere in the hallway, the grandfather clock ticked on indifferent, counting out the last seconds I would spend as a man who still trusted his son. I drew a breath, locked whatever was left of my heart behind something solid, and clicked. The recording opened on noise crowded, muffled the acoustic sprawl of a high-end venue in full evening swing. Beneath the layered sound, I could make out the string orchestra playing in the main ballroom, and over it all, the sharp, crystalline clinking of expensive glassware. Then silence dropped like a curtain. A heavy wooden door had swung shut somewhere on the recording, sealing the room off. The audio sharpened immediately. I could distinguish several voices, men in high spirits trading congratulations in that particular loose, swaggering register that belongs to people who believe they have already won. I placed the smooth, practiced voices of the Market Street liquidators immediately. They were deep into the celebration, raising toasts to the acquisition's aggressive timeline, throwing numbers around, projecting the profit margins they would carve out once Caldwell Global Supply had been broken apart and sold off. Then Derek's voice arrived. It came through the laptop speakers and filled the dark study with something I had not heard in it before complete ownership. He was relaxed in a way that telegraphed certainty, not calm. He thanked the senior partners for their collaboration and confirmed that any remaining legal complications would be fully resolved before Tuesday morning. Then the lead venture capitalist spoke over him, measured, direct. He wanted specifics. Exactly what was Derek's plan for ensuring my permanent exit from the company's structure? My grip on the tumbler tightened until I felt the crystal protest. I sat in silence, bracing for my son to walk the room through his scheme, the fabricated diagnosis, the manufactured deterioration. I was ready for a lie. What came instead was something else entirely. What Derek said went beyond the architecture of fraud. It was so precisely engineered for cruelty, so thoroughly marinated in deliberate malice, that my blood seemed to stop moving altogether. A soft, dismissive chuckle preceded his answer. "You don't need to worry about the old man," he said, his voice falling into something low and mocking as it addressed the room. "He is completely and utterly neutralized. I have been slowly adjusting his daily blood pressure medication for the past 3 months. Nothing immediately lethal, just calibrated to produce severe disorientation, memory lapses, and chronic physical fatigue. The doctors have concluded it is rapid onset dementia. It is not. It is chemical compliance. By the time I deliver him to the locked psychiatric ward on Tuesday, his mind will be so thoroughly degraded he will not even remember his own name, let alone the access codes to the primary corporate accounts. The entire global empire is finally officially ours, gentlemen." The recording played on. I could hear in the audio every shade of what my son's voice had become. He let the room sit with what he had just said, let the revelation breathe before moving forward with the same flat, chilling confidence. "Gentlemen, the company is 100% mine," Derek said, his tone practically vibrating with arrogance. "My father Gerald has late-stage Alzheimer's. He is completely unhinged. Then next Tuesday I have a court order to commit him to a closed psychiatric ward. You can sign the buyout safely. The old man will be locked away in a padded room." Those words landed in the stillness of my study with the force of something physical. My lungs quit. The tumbler sat frozen in my grip as my mind worked slowly through what was pouring out of those speakers, the sheer uncut evil of it. The betrayal had reached its outermost boundary. Derek was not after my assets or the company alone. He was after whatever time I had left. He had constructed a plan to revoke my autonomy, dissolve my identity, and park what remained of me in an institution sealed off, sedated, forgotten, while the machinery of my dispossession ran its course. I let myself see it. The room they had picked for me, no window, no handle on the inside of the door. The injections that would eventually make his lie factually true chemistry, doing the work that nature hadn't yet finished. I would persist in there as a kind of echo alive in the technical sense, but with no reach, no recourse, no way to claw back what had been taken. And Derek, my son, would be stretched across some terrace in the Cayman Islands, drinking well surrounded by everything I had built with 40 years of my life. The architecture of it was almost too monstrous to hold in a single thought. A son carries his father's legacy forward. That is the oldest contract there is. He stands at the door as the years begin to press. Derek had looked at that same arrangement and seen leverage. He had taken Diane's death, my grief raw and real, and quietly reframed it as evidence of mental collapse. The sting of that particular betrayal went deeper than any of the rest. It severed the final thread. The child I had raised, who I had steadied on a bicycle seat, whose failures I had absorbed and whose path I had quietly cleared, was not in that room on the recording. A stranger was. A cold professional who had put my institutionalization on the agenda and was now fielding follow-up questions. And the venture capitalists asked none of those questions in outrage. No one in that lounge recoiled. What rose up instead was a low murmur of genuine appreciation. These were operators in the business of corporate demolition, and they recognized in Derek someone who could neutralize even a blood obstacle without flinching. That is a highly effective strategy. One of the senior investors offered, his voice smooth and stripped of anything resembling conscience. The medical mandate eliminates legal friction at every stage of the transfer. Once institutionalization is formalized, the board cannot contest your authority. The acquisition closes cleanly. The paperwork will be ready for your signature at precisely 9 on Monday morning. Excellent, Derek answered. The sound of a champagne flute being refilled carried cleanly through the feed. By the time the ink dries on the sale documents, Renata and I will be miles away. We have already finalized the offshore accounts. The transition will be completely seamless. I sat rigid in my leather chair, the thin morning light drawing long shadows across the mahogany desk. The full shape of what I was living inside sharpened in my mind like a blade finding its edge. I was alone in a house my son had quietly converted into a cage. Every meal set before me, every cup Renata had so graciously poured, every pill I had obediently swallowed across the past 3 months, all of it delivered with a purpose. All of it a measured dose of chemical subjugation. They had been poisoning me under my own roof, engineering my deterioration, with the patience of people who had already decided how the story ended. My wealth could not protect me now. My standing meant nothing. The only currency that still mattered was speed, the ability to strike before Tuesday arrived, and the window closed forever. On the recording, crystal glasses chimed softly as the men raised their toast. To the successful acquisition of Caldwell Global Supply, a voice rang out. And to your early retirement, Derek added his words, soaked in venomous, savoring mockery. I reached toward the keyboard, hand unsteady, ready to stop the playback. I had what I needed. The confession was complete. The transaction details, the timeline, the medical conspiracy laid out in their own voices. It was enough to bring in federal authorities and put my son behind the walls of a maximum security prison. I was prepared to shut the laptop and contact Conrad Ashworth to authorize the final phase of our counterattack. But before my finger reached the trackpad, the audio shifted. The polished wooden door of the Four Seasons Hotel Philadelphia VIP lounge swung open, and the celebratory atmosphere inside evaporated on the spot. The room went tight with the kind of silence that means something unscripted has entered. Derek! A soft voice cut through the stale air of the lounge, familiar, delicate, instantly recognizable. It moved through me like cold water. I knew that voice the way you know a sound that has only ever meant something good. It belonged to someone who was supposedly spending this evening at a quiet backyard, gathering in the suburbs kept far from the corporate spectacle unfolding downtown. It was the voice of a young woman I had always believed was too fragile, too anxious for rooms like this one. I sat locked in place as the unmistakable rustle of a heavy silk wedding gown swept across the hardwood floor of the VIP lounge. Measured footsteps drew toward the center of the room. It was Piper. My granddaughter, my beloved innocent Piper, had just walked directly into a den of predators. "Piper!" Derek's voice pivoted in an instant, the cold corporate authority folding away, replaced by something warm and paternal. "What are you doing away from the main ballroom? The investors are just wrapping up the last details." "I wanted to make sure everything was going exactly as we planned," Piper answered. I pressed the speaker closer to my ear. Her tone was nothing like the soft, hesitant voice I had always known from her. It was precise, controlled, carrying a confidence I had never once heard her use. My heart slammed against my ribs as the implications of what I was hearing began to take shape. "The paperwork is set for Monday," Derek assured her, his manner smooth and unbothered. "The old man is back at the estate, completely sedated. He missed the whole evening, just as you predicted." "Good," Piper said, her voice projecting clearly into the hidden microphone. "Because if we are going to liquidate grandfather's empire and disappear to the islands, I need absolute confirmation that the Market Street funds will clear before Tuesday morning. I am not boarding that plane until the $50 million is safely locked in our Cayman accounts." The room tipped sideways. The whiskey glass slipped from my fingers and shattered across the floor. It was not just Derek and Renata. The corruption ran through the entire bloodline. My own granddaughter had been the architect, or so that single horrifying second seemed to announce. But my mind overloaded, and reeling had betrayed me. The cold voice demanding confirmation of the Cayman transfer was not Piper. It belonged to one of the venture capital partners, yet the rustle of heavy silk had been real. And now came the footsteps, quick, uneven, rushing into the center of the lounge. The room fell completely still. The clinking glasses went quiet. The laughter died in the throats of every man present. A trembling voice broke through the cigar-thick air. This was Piper. My actual Piper. The crushing pressure I had felt on my chest lifted and was instantly replaced by a sharper pain entirely because what I heard in her voice was something no calculation could produce. She was hyperventilating, fighting just to form words around the sobs that kept breaking through. "Where is he?" she demanded. "Where is Grandpa? Why is he not here?" "You promised me he was coming. You said his car was already on the way." Everything in her voice was real. There was nothing hidden in it. No angle, no performance. She had no part in their scheme. She was not a co-conspirator, she was collateral. Another piece moved around the board by people who had no use for her except as cover. Derek attempted to answer, but the smooth authority he had commanded all evening was gone. He stumbled, caught completely off guard by her sudden appearance. Before he could piece together a convincing lie, Renata moved in. Her voice slid through the audio feed, a performance of tenderness so precise it made something in my gut recoil. "Oh, sweetie." Renata's tone wrapped itself in manufactured warmth, pitched for both Piper and the investors to absorb. She moved closer to the microphone, dropping her voice to a whisper engineered to land like compassion. "Don't cry, darling, you'll ruin your beautiful makeup. We didn't want to tell you today of all days, but something happened at the house this morning." What happened?" Piper gasped, her voice collapsing into raw panic. "Is he okay? What happened to Grandpa?" Renata released a perfectly rehearsed sigh, the sound of reluctant tragedy delivered by someone who had practiced it. "Grandpa had a medical episode this morning, sweetheart. A mini stroke after breakfast. The doctors came to the house. He is stable, but it was serious. He's disoriented, darling. He doesn't recognize anyone, not even your father. He cannot walk without assistance. Oh no. The word tore out of Piper like something broken loose. The sound of it rang through my study walls. I have to go to him. I need to leave right now. You can't leave. Derek cut in, his voice suddenly hard and urgent beneath the surface of concern. He needed her in that room. He needed the tableau intact. He specifically asked us to keep you here. He said he was too ashamed of his condition. He couldn't bear the idea of you seeing him like that in a wheelchair on your wedding day. He begged us to let you have this evening. He wanted us to tell you that he loves you more than anything in this world. I sat without moving, fists pressed into the arms of the chair. The evil of what they had constructed was almost architectural in its completeness. They had taken a fabricated medical crisis and driven it into the heart of a young bride. On the one day of her life, she should have been untouchable. They had turned my love for Piper, the most unconditional thing I had left, into a weapon, shaping it into a reason for my absence that she would not question. To her, I was a man hiding from his own helplessness. To the investors listening in that room, I was a man already gone. And then the security arrangements from the previous evening clicked into place with absolute terrible precision. The wall of hired personnel at the Four Seasons Hotel Philadelphia entrance. The rigid guest list. The physical barrier that had kept me from setting foot inside. It was not simply about shielding the venture capitalists from my presence or concealing the gala they had bankrolled with my own money. The entire apparatus had one additional function: keeping Piper from laying eyes on me. Because if I had walked through those doors in my custom Brioni tuxedo, standing straight and clear-eyed, Renata's carefully constructed lie would have collapsed on the spot. Piper would have seen immediately that I had not suffered any stroke, that I recognized every face in the room, that there was no wheelchair, no cognitive fog, nothing. Every word spoken to the investors about my deteriorating mental state would have been exposed as fiction in front of the very men Derek was counting on to sign. They had to hold me outside, and they had to hold her in. Piper's genuine grief was not a byproduct of their strategy. It was a structural component of it, deployed to accelerate the hostile takeover of Caldwell Global Supply. On the recording, Renata continued weaving her lies around Piper in a low, soothing murmur, one hand guiding her gently back toward the main reception and away from the room where the real business had just been conducted. The heavy wooden door clicked shut again, leaving Derek alone with the silent investors. He immediately let out a long, exaggerated sigh of relief. "You see, gentlemen," Derek said, his voice settling back into its normal, arrogant register. "The family situation is tragic, but it is being handled. Now let us return to the precise terms of the liquidation." I had heard everything I needed. I reached forward and pressed the stop button on the keyboard with deliberate finality. The encrypted audio cut off, dropping my home office back into deep, absolute silence. I sat in the thin morning light, eyes fixed on the dark monitor. The profound, suffocating sadness that had pressed down on my soul across the past 6 months. The raw grief of losing Diane, the slow agony of watching my son become a stranger, was gone. Completely gone. What moved in to replace it was not grief and not rage. It was something colder. A glacial, mechanical wrath that settled into my bones and left no space for mercy, hesitation, or the kind of forgiveness a father might otherwise find. Derek and Renata were no longer family. They were a malignant infection requiring surgical removal from my life and from everything I had built. They had taken my money. They had plotted to take my freedom. They had used my granddaughter's most sacred day as a stage prop and broken her heart in the process. I pulled my cell phone across the mahogany desk. My thumb moved through the contact list until it landed on her private number. The Market Street venture capital firm was expecting to put pen to paper on the final acquisition documents Monday morning. Derek was expecting to deliver me to a psychiatric ward on Tuesday. But the entire framework of their criminal conspiracy depended on one thing above all else: Piper remaining completely in the dark. It depended on the illusion of my silent, compliant deterioration holding firm. I pressed the call button and raised the phone to my ear. It was time to bring their carefully constructed world down. Piper answered on the third ring. Her voice was small, hollowed out by tears and exhaustion. She offered a cautious hello, bracing for bad news about my condition. I kept my own voice level and steady. I told her I needed to see her in person immediately, somewhere away from the reach of her parents' influence. I directed her to a quiet, out-of-the-way coffee shop on the northern edge of the city, a modest place the two of us had frequented together when she was still a little girl. I was explicit she was not to breathe a word to Derek or Renata about where she was going. I could hear the confusion and the fragile, desperate hope colliding in her brief silence before she agreed. I arrived early. I chose a secluded booth in the back corner, ordered a black coffee, and placed the manila folder squarely on the table in front of me. I had dressed in a crisp, charcoal herringbone suit and carried myself with the straight-backed posture of a man in full command of his body and his mind. No wheelchair, no vacant, unfocused stare. Only the founder of Caldwell Global Supply present, composed and waiting for his granddaughter. The bell above the door chimed. Piper walked in, looking hollowed out, her eyes swollen and red from grieving a loss that had never happened. She scanned the room with visible anxiety before her gaze found me. I watched the shock move through her like a current. Her entire body went rigid, then still rooted to the middle of the aisle. I rose from the booth, offered a warm and steady smile, and opened my arms. She crossed the cafe floor at something close to a run and hit my chest hard, dissolving immediately into deep, shaking sobs. Both hands seized the lapels of my jacket as she pressed her face into my shoulder. She kept saying she was sorry, that she had been terrified, that she had believed I was gone. I held her without speaking and let the first wave of it pass. When the worst of it had moved through her, I guided her into the seat across from mine. She stared at me with wet, wide eyes, trying to reconcile what she was seeing with what she had been told. She noted my hands, steady, unshaking. She registered my focus. She whispered that the doctors had reported a severe stroke, that I could no longer walk, no longer place faces. I reached across and enclosed her trembling hands in mine. I told her quietly that no doctor had said anything of the kind. I told her I was in perfect health and that every single word her parents had fed her was a deliberate, vicious lie. Piper shook her head, struggling to absorb the scale of it. "Why would they do something that cruel?" she asked, her voice fracturing. "Why would they keep you away from my wedding?" I did not reach for soft language to cushion the impact. She was a grown woman, and she deserved the unvarnished truth about the people who had raised her. I opened the manila folder and pushed the first document across the table: offshore routing numbers, the full wire transfer of my life savings, the Cayman Islands Shell Company, registered under her mother's maiden name. I walked her through how Derek had fabricated a federal audit to terrorize me into surrendering my liquid assets without resistance, and how the money she had believed was seeding her new business had been stolen from under her without her knowledge. Then I set my laptop on the table between us. I told her about the military-grade listening device Conrad's covert operative had planted in the Four Seasons Hotel Philadelphia VIP lounge. I told her that what she was about to hear would be the hardest thing she had ever listened to, but that it was the truth, documented, unambiguous, and irrefutable. I pressed play. Piper sat rigid in the booth as the audio filled the narrow space between us. She heard the crystal glasses. She heard the easy, arrogant laughter of the venture capitalists. Then she heard her father's voice, relaxed and boastful, claiming total dominion over the company. She listened as Derek described his plan to chemically sedate me through altered blood pressure medication and deliver me to a locked psychiatric ward by Tuesday morning. She heard him guarantee the investors a clean $50 million buyout, while I spent the rest of my days in a padded room. The color drained entirely from Piper's face, but the recording was not finished. She heard her own voice enter, urgent, distraught, asking where I was. And then she heard Renata, that smooth, practiced sweetness spinning the lie about my stroke with the confidence of someone who had rehearsed it, painting me as a broken, humiliated old man too ashamed to be present on his granddaughter's wedding day. She heard Derek redirect her grief with surgical precision, steering her out of the room so the deal could close without interference. I stopped the audio and closed the laptop. The silence at our table had genuine weight to it. Piper sat motionless, staring at the dark screen, her breathing shallow and uneven. Her entire understanding of her own life was coming apart in real time. Every fixture of trust and love she had organized her world around had just been revealed as deliberately constructed rot. The wedding she had believed was the most beautiful day of her life was exposed for what it actually was, an elaborate, expensive smokescreen. A corporate networking event engineered to deliver investors to the table while her grandfather was being buried alive, and the money was already in motion offshore. Her parents had used the most significant day of her life as cover. They had weaponized her happiness. For several long minutes, Piper said nothing at all. She sat with the weight of it absorbing the full, hideous depth of the betrayal. I watched the grief slowly vacate her expression. I watched the confusion and heartbreak calcify into something sharper and altogether different. The tears stopped. Her spine straightened. She took on the same rigid, unyielding posture I had been carrying since the moment I understood what they had done. The devastation in her eyes hardened into a cold, focused fury that was a precise reflection of the fire burning in my own chest. She was a true Caldwell, and the Caldwell blood ran deep. Piper reached up and wiped the last traces of moisture from her cheeks with the back of her hand. She drew a slow breath and let it out in one long, controlled exhale. She looked directly at me. "Grandpa," she said, her voice dropping into a smooth, dangerous calm. "What time is the board meeting tomorrow? I want to watch them burn." I smiled a cold, precise smile that matched her determination exactly. I told her the meeting was set for 9:00 sharp. We spent the entire length of that Sunday afternoon mapping out every detail of our strike together. Piper did not go back to the estate she shared with her new husband, a man Derek had handpicked to serve his corporate image. Instead, she disappeared into a luxury suite I had reserved under a corporate alias. Conrad Ashworth worked through the night finalizing the emergency injunctions and coordinating with his contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. By the time Monday morning arrived, the trap was perfectly set. I dressed with deliberate precision, my sharpest, darkest tailored suit, a crisp white shirt, a crimson tie. I did not look like a man in cognitive decline. I looked like the undisputed founder and absolute ruler of Caldwell Global Supply. When my private driver brought the car to a stop outside the towering glass facade of corporate headquarters, Conrad Ashworth was already posted at the entrance. Flanking him were two stern figures in immaculate dark suits with discreet earpieces, Special Agents Novak and Vance from the Federal White-Collar Crime Division. They had reviewed the unedited audio recordings and the forged medical documents. Fully briefed the previous night, fully authorized and ready to execute the warrants. Piper stepped out of the vehicle directly behind me, dressed in a sharp, dark blazer that projected the same professional armor I was wearing. Not a trace remained of the weeping bride from the day before. We bypassed the reception and rode the private elevator straight to the top floor. The display ticked upward, counting down the final seconds of Derek's counterfeit empire. We stepped out into the plush, carpeted corridor leading to the primary glass boardroom. It was exactly 8:55 in the morning. Through the frosted privacy bands on the glass walls, the silhouettes were unmistakable. Derek occupied the head of the massive mahogany table, a position he had seized prematurely. Renata sat right beside him, her expression carrying the satisfied smile of a predator moments from the kill. Arranged along the length of the table were the senior partners from the Market Street venture capital firm, the same men who had raised their glasses to toast my institutionalization just 48 hours earlier. Thick portfolios holding the $50 million sale contracts were stacked neatly before them. Expensive pens hovered over the signature lines. They were seconds away from completing the largest theft of my life. I raised one hand in silence, directing the federal agents to take positions flanking the heavy oak doors. I looked at Piper and gave her a single firm nod. She returned it without hesitation, her expression perfectly composed and utterly unreadable. The antique grandfather clock in the executive lobby struck 9:00. The deep chimes rolled down the corridor. I closed my hand around the brass handles of the oak doors and drove them open with force. The heavy slabs swung wide and struck the interior walls of the boardroom. The impact detonated through the quiet, professional atmosphere like a gunshot. Every head in the room snapped to the entrance. I walked in at a slow, deliberate pace, posture, rigid eyes fixed entirely on my son. Conrad Ashworth entered smoothly on my right, leather briefcase in hand. Piper came in on my left, chin raised, radiating a quiet and lethal composure. The two federal agents followed and immediately anchored themselves just inside the doorway, sealing the exit. The blood left Derek's face in an instant. His mouth worked open and shut several times, his brain refusing to process what was standing in front of him. The silver pen slipped from his fingers and struck the mahogany with a sharp, ringing clatter. Derek stammered, his voice fracturing into something thin and strained. "What are you doing here? You are supposed to be resting." The audacity of that lie, spoken even as his world visibly came apart, stoked the cold fire burning in my chest. Renata sat frozen, her eyes moving frantically between me, the federal agents, and her own daughter. She looked genuinely terrified. The venture capitalists had stiffened in their chairs, already grasping that the seamless, lucrative acquisition they had been promised was coming apart in front of them. I offered no greeting. I did not raise my voice or perform any dramatic theatrics. I moved with smooth, icy composure, which carried a great deal more menace than any outburst could. I walked directly to the head of the table and stopped just short of where Derek sat. I drew a thick, heavily stamped file from inside my jacket, the fraudulently obtained power of attorney, the forged medical evaluation, and the official injunctions Conrad had prepared. I lifted the stack and brought it down hard on the center of the mahogany table. The crack it made echoed off the glass walls and sent the venture capitalists flinching back in their seats. I leaned forward, both hands flat on the table, my face brought close to my son's. "I am not here to rest, Derek," I said, my voice carrying a pure glacial weight. "I am here to clean house." I turned briefly to address the investors. "I suggest you gentlemen put your pens away immediately," I told them, keeping my tone civil but threading it with unmistakable menace. "The $50 million acquisition you are attempting to finalize rests entirely on fraudulent documents, stolen corporate authority, and a criminal conspiracy to commit an elderly man to a psychiatric facility against his will. Furthermore, as of Friday night, Caldwell Global Supply no longer holds a single proprietary algorithm or logistics patent. The digital assets your firm believed it was purchasing have been legally extracted and secured inside a private holding company. What you are currently trying to buy is a completely empty, functionally worthless shell." The lead venture capitalist turned a deep shade of crimson, his fury directed squarely at Derek as he absorbed the realization that he had been played for a fool. Derek pushed back from the table, hands trembling, eyes cutting toward the door. "You cannot do this," he whispered, perspiration forming along his forehead. "I am the acting executive. I have the legal authority." Conrad Ashworth moved forward, snapping his briefcase open with a sharp click. "You have absolutely nothing," he said, his voice cold and precise. "I am officially serving you with an emergency federal injunction, stripping you of all corporate titles effective immediately." Agent Novak stepped forward, drawing a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "Derek Caldwell," the agent announced, his voice cutting cleanly across the silent room. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you use it." I glanced at Piper, who stood watching her parents unraveling with a steady, tearless gaze. The empire was secure. The trash was being taken out. The lead investor from Market Street stared at the table's surface, his face a rigid mask of cold fury. He set his silver pen down beside the unsigned contract with deliberate calm. Conrad Ashworth gave them no time to collect themselves. He reached into the briefcase and laid a crisp, officially sealed legal document directly in front of the lead venture capitalist. "I strongly suggest you review the addendums regarding intellectual property," Conrad said, his tone carrying absolute authority. "The company your team spent months evaluating no longer exists in any functional capacity. The Caldwell Global Supply infrastructure has been entirely stripped of its proprietary routing algorithms, its custom supply chain management software, and its full portfolio of international logistics patents. Every piece of essential technology required to operate the shipping fleet was legally severed from the primary corporate body on Friday evening. Those assets belong exclusively to Gerald. What remains is a hollow shell, empty warehouses, and idle trucks. But Derek promised you a global empire. He was attempting to sell you an empty cardboard box. The senior investors needed nothing more. They were predators, but they were not reckless ones. A catastrophic liability was a catastrophic liability, and every man at that table recognized it immediately. The lead partner seized the $50 million buyout contract in both hands and tore the thick stack straight through. He pitched the torn documents directly into Derek's chest. "You arrogant, stupid boy," the investor said, his voice barely contained. "You have wasted our time and incinerated your own career in a single morning." The men rose together, gathered their briefcases, and moved out of the glass boardroom without a backward glance, leaving the wreckage of Derek's ambitions scattered across the floor. Derek dropped back into his leather chair, looking utterly hollowed out, struggling to breathe, like something dragged onto dry land. Renata trembled beside him, her eyes ranging toward the exit, hunting for a way out that no longer existed. But I was not finished. I reached inside my jacket and produced a small matte black flash drive. I set it on the polished table and let it slide to a stop directly in front of my son. That drive contains the unedited high-fidelity audio recording of your private celebration in the Four Seasons Hotel Philadelphia VIP lounge. I said, my voice settling into a quiet glacial whisper. It documents your entire manufactured medical strategy in your own words. I heard every single word, Derek. I heard you boast about tampering with my blood pressure medication. I heard your precise, calculated plan to strip away my rights and consign me to a locked psychiatric ward. I heard you boast about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Renata let out a sharp, hysterical scream, covering her face with both hands, as the full magnitude of their exposure finally crashed down on her. The two FBI agents who had been standing quietly beside the heavy oak doors moved forward into the center of the room. The metallic clink of steel handcuffs rang out across the silent boardroom. Agent Novak seized Derek by the shoulder, hauling him out of the leather chair and wrenching his arms behind his back. "Derek Caldwell," the agent announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute, irreversible finality. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Derek broke down completely, his knees giving way as the cold steel clicked shut around his wrists. He looked pitiful, every trace of his expensive tailoring and arrogant composure stripped away in an instant. "Please, Dad," he sobbed, tears running freely down his pale, damp face. "Please stop this. I am your son. We can fix this. I will give everything back." Before I could offer a single word in response to his groveling, Piper stepped out from the shadows. She moved slowly and deliberately around the far side of the massive table, her bearing radiating a quiet, devastating composure. She came to a stop directly in front of her weeping mother. Renata looked up, her eyes searching her daughter's face for any fragment of sympathy, from the same daughter she had manipulated so ruthlessly. Piper offered nothing. Instead, she reached up to her ears and removed the heavy, sparkling diamond earrings she had been wearing, the extravagant wedding gift Renata had purchased, using funds stolen from my accounts. Piper set them down on the mahogany table with a sharp, dismissive click, right beside the torn contracts. "I am moving in with Grandpa," Piper said, her voice steady and completely emptied of warmth. "You are absolutely dead to me." The federal agents began pulling Derek toward the boardroom exit. He dragged his feet, straining against their grip, consumed by sheer, unvarnished panic. His eyes found mine across the long, polished expanse of the table. "Dad, please don't do this to me!" he wailed, his voice climbing into a high, desperate pitch. "Show some mercy. You cannot just lock me out of my own life." I stood straight and buttoned my jacket slowly, one button at a time. I thought of the brass doors of the Four Seasons Hotel Philadelphia. I thought of standing on the cold pavement outside, held back by hired security, while my own family toasted my destruction on the other side of the wall. I looked my son directly in the eye and felt nothing but a cold, clean, satisfying finality. "You are not on the list, Derek," I said, my voice cutting through his hysterical sobbing like a blade drawn across still water. There was obviously a terrible mistake. I turned my back on him without a flicker of hesitation. I extended my arm to Piper. She took it without a word, head held high. Together we walked out of the glass boardroom, leaving the ruined, smoldering wreckage of his false empire behind us. We stepped into the private elevator and let the doors close on the screaming and the handcuffs ready at last to begin what came next. If you have stayed with me through all of this, I am grateful. Truly. This was not an easy story to carry, and it is not an easy one to set down. What this cost me was years. Years of trust poured into someone who had already decided I was worth more as an obstacle removed than as a father honored. The grief of that is something you do not simply shake off, but I believe God does not waste suffering. The very patience they mistook for weakness became the foundation of everything that brought them down. The Lord's timing has a way of arriving exactly when it needs to, not a moment sooner. Here is what I would want anyone who has lived something like this to hold on to. Document everything. A paper trail is the quietest weapon you will ever carry, and the most powerful one in a courtroom. When someone tries to rewrite your mind, trust what your own hands have built. Confusion is a tool, do not let it be used on you. If a trusted person pressures you to sign anything quickly, that pressure itself is the warning. Slow down. The urgency is theirs, not yours. Never let grief make you easy to deceive. Mourning is real and it is right, but keep one eye open. If this story reached something in you, a memory, a worry, a situation you are quietly living through, please share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a thought in the comments. Your words matter more than you know, and they may be exactly what someone else is searching for today. And if you haven't yet subscribed to Dad Revenge, there are more stories here, and every one of them is worth your time. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourself, and I will see you in the next one.